I remember so many people leaving the city because there was just no jobs, like zero. And that is a classic situation of simple supply and demand economics, where you have an oversupply of something and no demand. So my first property, I get asked this so many times, and I think the problem with this particular deal is that it might be a little bit unrealistic to some people, but I'm going to break it down for people, because I think when they hear it, like, you know, off the hop, they're like, well, how the fuck am I going to be able to do that? But when I start breaking it down a little bit more, it's not that difficult. So, and I get asked this a lot by very, you know, young people, like, you know, late teens and early
I'd also
20s.
say, like, when you break down the numbers, that's what's transferable today in terms of like how you actually got it done. In terms of what assets you actually bought, sure, that won't be relatable to today, but you can adjust it for whatever is available today. Yeah. Go ahead.
So back in, and this was arguably way worse of a time. So back in, it was right around 2007, you know, maybe even 2006, I dropped out of school. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, yada, yada, yada. And I remember, I don't remember if it was a book, if it was an article. I don't remember what I saw, but I remember seeing some sort of stat. And I don't remember if it was the most millionaires or a significant amount of self-made millionaires were produced by real estate or from real estate. So I was like, well, I have nothing going on. I don't know what I'm going to do. So let's get into real estate. So my first deal was 14 condos on Riverside Drive in the Lagoyo building back in 08 time. And I bought that package of real estate for around $900,000. So a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, well, how the fuck did you get all that money? So I had saved up. I want to make sure that the numbers are at least, because I remember at that point in time, you can get a good, like pretty good LTV as well. Yeah, it was about an 80-20 LTV. They were all residential mortgages that I got from RBC at the time. So how did I get, it was a little bit over 80-20. I would probably say, you know, I saved up like maybe like 187 or something like that. I can't remember exactly the dollar figure, but I'd saved up around 20% of the down payment. Okay.
And you saved this up over how long?
Exactly. So I had saved, well, this is the kicker now. So this is why this is digestible. I had saved every penny that I possibly could from literally as young as I was when I was doing the papers. So I'm talking about like even late grade school, early high school, from doing the papers. Yeah,
so like 10 years.
Like literally 10 years, 8 to, you know, whatever, 10 years. Like 8 to 10 years or something like that. So I had saved up. Now you got to think, I was working as much as I possibly could. This is where the disconnect starts to become. So now I'm like, I bought 14 condos for $900,000. Okay. So that's a big disconnect. But then I'm like, well, I saved my money over the course of 10 years, right? Or so. But then the disconnect starts to become, well, I was also making minimum wage at the time for like, it was like fucking $7. Okay. Now you're making quite a bit more money, but I understand that real estate is quite a bit more expensive. But, you know, at the end of the day, I was saving anywhere from, you know.
Yeah, like after tax, what do you think your actual percentage was of what you were saving?
I was probably saving around $20,000, $25,000 a year. And that was just my ability to live significantly below my means. You know, obviously I was a teenager, still living with my parents. You know, I graduate out of high school, I get a job working TPT at GM. Working for, you know, 20 something bucks an hour, which is like very, very common these days. If you're adding at least some sort of value to the business, it's probably, you know, you're graduating out of school, you're making 20 something bucks an hour. You know, especially with minimum wage going up to $16, you know, in October. But I was still working. I had 3 jobs at that point in time when I was late, probably not late teens, but graduating out of high school. I was working TPT at GM on the weekends. Mm-hmm. I was bouncing as well, so I would try to work days. I tried to schedule my schooling around being able to work at GM on Friday, and then I would go in on, say, late Friday, bounce, and then Saturday I'd also bounce because we didn't do Saturday at GM. It was only usually Friday and Mondays. Mm-hmm. And then I was working at Zehrs in the produce department on the rest of the week after school or whenever I could get a shift or whatever, right? So I was working almost probably full-time hours as a student, right? And whether or not you think that that's viable, it was. Mm-hmm. For me, I did it. I didn't finish school. I dropped out, but I was able to stay afloat. I just wanted it bad enough, right? I wanted it bad enough. Even at that point in time, I didn't even know what I wanted, but all I knew was that if I had some sort of nest egg or if I had some sort of, capital sitting on the sidelines, that when an opportunity came up and I was able to capitalize on that opportunity, I was able to do it. Mm-hmm. And that was the biggest kicker, and that's how I was able to take down my first real estate deal and why it was so big. And how I was able to accomplish that was because I saved a good amount of money, and I did it working like normal jobs, right? So now this is obviously I understand the fact that, the average home price in the area now is 10 times what I was buying these condos for. I fully understand that. But we also have, situations where there's hyperinflation at this point, So back then, you have to understand, it was the '08 recession. It was a fucking ghost town in Windsor. Mm-hmm. You had a situation.
I remember.
What?
I remember.
Yeah. You had a situation where, again, Great Recession. People argue that, that didn't impact Canada that much. Well, it impacted Windsor. Mm-hmm. The way that it impacted Windsor was the Great Recession took down the automotive sector. Windsor was extremely, it was basically reliant, not somewhat reliant. It was reliant on the automotive industry. We were basically automotive, tool and die, and mold. That's what we were. There was pretty much nothing else. There was your basic service and retail, whatever. But the automotive industry went down. I mean, we were talking back then, maybe somebody can fact check it or whatever if you want, but I have to imagine Windsor's vacancy rate back in that day was for sure double digits, probably mid, 15%, maybe even pushing 20%. Mm-hmm. I remember so many people leaving the city because there was just no jobs, like zero. And that is a classic situation of simple supply and demand economics, where you have an oversupply of something and no demand. Mm-hmm. So real estate was added. I bought a condo. I remember about 2 to 3 months later, there was a condo that came up in the same building where I bought those first 14. After I did the first deal for the first 14, I remember another condo coming up in the building for like $24,000, and I bought that fucking thing for I got I don't know, 20 grand. Yeah. And I remember thinking in my head, how the fuck do I not do this deal? Even if, and what ended up happening was, my thought process during that time was, even if pricing gets, my condos were cash flowing. First of all, they were all cash flowing because the fucking debt on them was nothing. Yeah. So during that period of time, I remember thinking, people were telling me, these are going to go to nothing. The reason why they were saying that was going to go to nothing was because real estate in Detroit was selling for literally $1. Yeah. I remember, Detroit literally, I remember thinking to myself, how the fuck do I get out over there to be able to buy these properties for $1? And I would just let them sit there if I could, but I couldn't do it. Obviously I was new as a newbie and mm-hmm. It just wasn't viable. Also, the properties that they were selling for $1 in Detroit, they were also in gangland. So it's not really an area that I'd want to be in anyways, right.
Looking and
uninhabitable. Yeah, it's just, it was not a good environment. Yeah. But, at the end of the day, there was a reason why that was going on. But, looking at it, the extreme where Detroit was heavily reliant on the automotive industry, that was also even way worse than Windsor. So anyways, I remember, again, the rental rates that I was getting, even though they were so low, I'm talking like $500-$600 in rent at the time. Even if those properties were to get chopped in half in terms of value, I'd still be cash flow positive, even if I took a 25% hit on rent. So I'm like, you almost can't lose at this point in time, because even, I remember, thinking like, how much worse could Windsor actually get? Like, Windsor will never be a Detroit, and that was the worst. That would be the worst comparable situation was Detroit, and Windsor wouldn't be it could never get as bad as Detroit, in my opinion, at that point in time. Was I right or wrong? Maybe Windsor could, but at the end of the day, that was my thought process, that it's probably not going to get any worse, and I was right. So, at the end of the day, that's still probably one of my best deals that I've ever done. Those in some cases, those properties, I remember that one particular property that I owned, that I bought, that 15th condo in that building, I sold for 10 times what I bought it for. Maybe 8 years later. I ended up selling off 7 of those units, and I kept 8 only on the water. You know how I feel about waterfront property or water views or whatever. Even though real estate is in short demand now, waterfront's even less. And you're always going to have people interested in waterfront, so that's what I ended up keeping. But that was my first deal.
Did you want to, and I know we can keep that clip kind of like to itself, but did you also want to talk about how that same structure or logic could be applied to somebody getting started today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why it's easy for me to be bullish on real estate long term is because I come from that era. I remember how bad it was. I remember investing in Windsor at the time when I remember in Windsor, it's such an incredible dynamic that we have. What a polarizing environment we have for real estate investors in Windsor, because there's so many investors now that are, coming out of the woodwork to get into the market. And when I started, not even that long ago, you got to think like this, in hindsight, this isn't like that long ago. But man, what a polarizing difference it was back then. I don't remember one person telling me that this was a good idea. I don't remember even being able to talk to anybody that even owned any real estate at that point in time in Windsor. I remember my one friend, Marco, who I ended up buying the package of real estate from. He was literally liquidating everything. He sold off the majority. So he had like well over 300 units in Windsor. He sold the majority of his apartment buildings to Skyline at that time. That guy would be worth, if he would have kept all that, I don't even know how, because he still does have some choice properties that he is like really likes. He has choice properties that are very light on management is what he ended up keeping. But I remember him even wanting to get out of real estate because the market was so bad. People just didn't think Windsor was going to recover. Like, it was an absolute disaster zone. And so how would I apply the mentality that I had back then to today's market environment? It would be the exact same. I approach everything for the last 15 years of doing this. I've approached every deal that I've done with a certain level of, being cautiously optimistic. I'm bullish on real estate long term. I'm less bullish about Canadian real estate right now than I am US real estate. Canadian real estate, I feel, is very volatile based off of the amount of debt and the home values in Canada versus the income of the average Canadian, where we're not seeing the same spread like you would in the States, which basically tells you that the financial stability of homeowners and home buyers in the US is or even the economy as a whole, the real estate market as a whole, the housing market as a whole, is healthier in the US than it is in Canada, and that the likelihood of a bubble popping is much more likely in Canada than it is in the US. And this is why I've built out the infrastructure to allow investment into the US for Canadians because of these reasons, because I wanted to do it for myself. But that's not to say that I still wouldn't invest if a deal came across if you presented me a deal right now in Canada that when I run it through our underwriting, program or whatever you want to call it, and it actually made sense from a returns perspective, I would still do that deal.
Yeah.
The problem is I cannot find anything that makes sense in this country, let alone in Southwestern Ontario. That is the problem. Now, what do I mean by something that makes as much sense? It's very difficult to find something, as an example, that cash flows as a 5-year average 7% and with an annualized rate of return of 25%. It's very difficult to find that these days. Those are still doable in the US. That's the bulk. That's the basis. Sorry, not bulk. That's the basis of what I want to see in an investment.
Yeah.
7% average cash on cash return over 5 years and 25% annualized rate of return every year. I don't remember the last time I saw that in Windsor. To be honest with you, last time I saw that in Windsor was probably a warehouse that I bought, to be honest with you. Now, what I do see as an opportunity in Windsor right now is increasing unit density on land. So what do I mean by that? Say for example, the last deal that I bought that was residential in Windsor was a home with the option to sever the land next door. The home was pushed over onto one side. I could sever the lot, produce another lot, put up a duplex next door with an ADU in the back. And I might be able to get not a duplex, but a basement unit in the one house on the one side and an ADU in the back of that.
Right. So turning one house into six
units. Yeah, exactly. So that's what I see as a viable option. Also, obviously, with our builder license, I have some land that, industrial buildings are sitting on that, eventually will be turned into condos and, or apartment buildings or whatever, but that's not in the, the soon future, I guess you could say. But that's what I would be focusing on right now. If I was in Windsor looking to invest in real estate, that's the deal that I've seen makes the most sense, is leveraging a home with a large lot that you can sever and build unit density on. Yeah.